Every legend has its secrets, and even America's most beloved sports car hides a chapter, almost too strange to believe. The Chevrolet Corvette, the car that symbolized American. Performance for decades came close to being powered by something that seemed more at home in experimental aircraft than on open highways. It was the early 1970s. The Corvette had become an icon, a red-blooded American machine with V8 thunder under the hood. But in the shadow of the oil crisis, emissions, regulations, and changing consumer tastes, General Motors began looking for alternatives to the traditional engine. The world was shifting, and Chevy's engineers knew they couldn't rely on yesterday's technology forever. That's when they turned to a radical idea: the rotary engine. Compact, lightweight, and capable of screaming to high RPMs with silky smoothness, it promised everything a new generation of sports car buyers might crave. Across the ocean, Mazda was already experimenting with Wankel engines in their RX series, and GM wasn't about to let the future slip away. In secret, Chevrolet developed a prototype Corvette, unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't just another V8 powerhouse. This was a mid-engine, rotary-powered machine designed to shatter expectations and redefine what it meant to be America's sports car. Its name was the XP-882, but to history, it would become something more: the Corvette that almost rewrote the rulebook. This is the untold story of the American Rotary, Chevy's secret experiment with a Corvette that could have changed everything. The birth of the XP-882. The XP-882 was not born in the spotlight. It came to life behind closed doors, in the quiet corners of General Motors' engineering facilities where radical ideas were allowed to breathe, if only for a moment. By the late 1960s, GM had grown restless. Across the Atlantic, European automakers were rewriting the rules of performance. Ferrari had the mystique, Porsche had precision, and Lamborghini had wild experimentation. America's answer, the Corvette, was holding its ground with raw V8 power, but GM's engineers wanted to prove they could innovate just as boldly as the Europeans. Enter the rotary revolution. The Wankel rotary engine, a German invention, was beginning to capture imaginations worldwide. Unlike the heavy piston-driven V8s that powered Detroit's muscle, the rotary promised something different: compact packaging, fewer moving parts, high-revving thrills, and smooth delivery of power. It was exotic, futuristic, and just crazy enough to excite GM's most daring thinkers. In 1969, General Motors signed a licensing agreement with NSU, the German company that held rights to Wankel technology. From that moment on, GM engineers began dreaming. Big and nowhere were those dreams bigger than in Chevrolet's advanced design studios, where the Corvette team imagined what a rotary-powered American supercar might look like. The XP-882 was conceived as the test bed for this bold vision. Unlike the front engine layout that had defined Corvettes since 1953, the XP-882 placed its heart behind the driver, embracing the mid-engine philosophy that had become the benchmark of European exotics. It was a radical departure, a Corvette not as America had known it, but as America might dare to imagine it. The styling was equally shocking. Low, wide, and aggressive, the XP-882 looked like it had rolled out of the future, its canopy-like cockpit, swooping fenders, and sharp lines made the current production Corvette look tame by comparison. Every inch of the prototype screamed experimental, as if it had escaped from a secret lab rather than a showroom floor. But it wasn't just about the body. Deep in the design files, engineers penciled in a powertrain unlike anything Chevrolet had ever attempted. A twin-rotor Wankel engine was slotted as the beating heart of the car, compact enough to fit in the middle of the chassis, light enough to sharpen handling, and powerful enough to challenge the best from Europe. It was an audacious gamble. The XP-882 wasn't built to be a show car. It was a statement, a proof of concept that asked a simple question. What if the Corvette didn't just evolve but completely transformed? For a moment in time, GM was ready to find out. Design and engineering marvel. The XP-882 wasn't just another prototype. It was a rolling science experiment, a glimpse of what a truly futuristic Corvette might look like if Chevy dared to break all the rules. From the very first glance, it was obvious that this car was not a traditional Corvette. Gone was the long hood/short deck formula that had defined the model for nearly 2 decades. In its place was a low-slung, wide-bodied wedge that looked more like something Ferrari or De Tomaso would have dreamed up than a Chevrolet. The XP-882 looked alien, almost otherworldly, a machine that seemed less destined for suburban driveways and more suited to the starting grid at Le Mans. The most radical change of all was the engine placement. For the first time in Corvette history, the power plant was moved behind the driver. This mid-engine setup was a direct nod to the layout that gave European supercars their superior balance and handling. Engineers knew that if the Corvette was going to compete with the best, it couldn't just rely on brute force V8 power. It needed cutting-edge engineering. By moving the engine, weight, distribution was transformed, turning the XP-882 into a car that could, at least in theory, dance through corners instead of just powering down straights. Then there was the rotary engine itself. GM's plan was to install a twin-rotor Wankel in the XP-882, a compact unit that seemed impossibly small compared to the big block V8s of the day. Its size meant designers could sculpt the body lower and sleeker than ever before, while still leaving room for cooling systems, suspension, and safety structures. The promise of a high-revving, smooth, lightweight engine made the XP-882 feel less like a brute and more like a scalpel. Styling was no afterthought either. The XP-882's sharp nose, hidden headlights, and flowing lines gave it a futuristic presence. The canopy-style cockpit sat low and central, emphasizing the car's aggressive stance. Wide rear haunches hinted at the power that lay beneath, while vents and scoops suggested functionality as much as flair. Even the wheels, tucked beneath exaggerated arches, gave the impression of a car clinging to the road, ready to strike at any moment. Inside, the car was equally forward-thinking. While few details survive of the exact prototype interior, period photos and GM records show a minimalist but purposeful cockpit. Controls were driver-focused, emphasizing the XP-882's role not as a luxury cruiser but as a precision tool for speed. What made the XP-882 most impressive wasn't any single feature, but the way it all came together. This wasn't just a Corvette with a new engine or a new look. It was an entirely new concept of what a Corvette could be, a blend of American muscle, European sophistication, and experimental engineering. For those lucky enough to see it in person, the XP-882 was a shock. This wasn't a dream car made for auto shows and concept stages. It looked and felt like a real machine, one that could be built, tested, and maybe even raced. It carried itself not as a fantasy, but as a prototype that was almost ready to step into reality. And for a fleeting moment it seemed Chevrolet might do it. The future of the Corvette was here, and it had a rotary heart. the promise of the rotary. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a kind of fever spreading across the automotive world, a fascination with the rotary engine. The Wankel rotary, invented by German engineer Felix Wankel and popularized by NSU and later Mazda, promised to rewrite the rulebook for internal combustion. It was smaller, lighter, and mechanically simpler than a piston engine, and to General Motors, a company always hungry for technological dominance, the rotary looked like the golden ticket to the future. The appeal was obvious. Traditional piston engines relied on hundreds of moving parts. Pistons, connecting rods, valves, crankshafts, all working in precise harmony. The rotary, by contrast, used a single triangular rotor spinning inside an oval-like chamber to achieve the same combustion cycle. Fewer moving parts meant less friction, fewer breakdowns, and theoretically higher reliability. But what really caught GM's attention was power-to-weight efficiency. A small rotary could produce horsepower comparable to much larger piston engines, but in a package that weighed dramatically less and took up far less space. This meant designers had new freedom. They could build lower, sleeker, more aerodynamic cars without worrying about squeezing in a bulky V8 under the hood. The XP-882's wild profile was only possible because the rotary engine left so much room for creativity. Another selling point was refinement. Rotary engines were smooth, silky smooth. Unlike piston engines, which relied on explosions and abrupt directional changes, the rotaries' constant spinning motion meant less vibration and more consistent power delivery. For a futuristic sports car like the XP-882, this meant an engine that didn't just perform, but won. That felt advanced, high-tech, and utterly unlike anything on American roads. General Motors was so convinced by the rotary's potential that they signed one of the largest licensing agreements in the company's history with NSU in 1970. Engineers at GM's research labs went all in, experimenting with single, twin, and even four rotor designs. The rotary was pitched not just as Corvette's future, but as the future of GM plans were. Drawn up to power compact cars, trucks, and luxury sedans with the new engine. The XP-882 then wasn't just a wild prototype, it was meant to be the spearhead of a revolution. And make no mistake, the Corvette was the perfect canvas for such a bold experiment. Corvette buyers were performance-hungry, forward-thinking, and less concerned with tradition than, say, Cadillac or Chevrolet sedan customers. If any American car could sell the public on an unconventional engine, it was the Corvette. The idea of a lightweight, mid-engine sports car powered by a screaming, high-revving rotary was the kind of vision that could compete with Ferrari and Porsche on their own turf. To put it simply, the XP-882 was more than just a prototype. It was proof of concept for a bigger gamble that Americans could be convinced to trade their beloved thumping V8s for something smoother, smaller, and radically different. For a brief, shining moment, the rotary engine wasn't just a curiosity, it was the future. And in the XP-882, Chevrolet seemed ready to embrace it with open arms. The dream meets reality. On paper, the rotary engine seemed unbeatable. It was light, compact, smooth, and futuristic. In the XP-882, it gave Chevrolet a chance to present something that looked more like a European exotic than an American muscle car. For a moment, it felt like Detroit was about to leapfrog the rest of the world with a daring innovation, but reality has a way of humbling even the boldest ideas. The first problem was fuel consumption. While rotary engines were compact and powerful, They were notoriously thirsty. A twin rotor could deliver the same horsepower as a small block V8, but it often burned far more fuel doing it. At a time when gasoline was cheap, this might not have been a deal-breaker. But by the early 1970s, storm clouds were forming. The 1973 oil crisis loomed, and suddenly efficiency became a top priority. GM engineers knew they couldn't push a car onto the market that guzzled fuel faster than buyers could afford to fill it. Next came emissions. Rotary engines had a unique combustion process that made it harder to burn fuel completely. The result was higher levels of unburned hydrocarbons coming out of the exhaust. In the late 60s, this wasn't seen as a crisis, but by 1970, the U.S. Clean Air Act changed the game. Automakers were now legally required to meet strict emissions standards. The rotary, once hailed as a savior, suddenly looked like a regulatory nightmare. Then there was durability. In theory, fewer moving parts meant greater reliability. In practice, the opposite seemed true. Apex seals, the tiny strips of metal that sealed the rotor against the chamber walls, wore out quickly. When they failed, engines lost compression, power, and often their lives. Mazda would spend decades perfecting these seals, but GM's engineers struggled. A Corvette owner expecting to blast across the country at 150 miles per hour wouldn't tolerate an engine that needed a rebuild after just a few thousand miles, and finally, there was cost. Developing a rotary engine from scratch was staggeringly expensive. GM had already poured millions into licensing fees and research. Programs scaling production to power thousands of cars would have required billions more. The accountants at Chevrolet and GM headquarters began asking the hard question: was this worth it? Especially when the tried-and-true V8 was not only cheaper, but beloved by Corvette fans. All these issues converged at once. What was meant to be the Corvette's boldest leap forward suddenly looked like a dead end. Engineers could solve one problem, say, apex, seal durability, but then fuel consumption would look worse. Fix the fuel problem and emissions would skyrocket. The rotary seemed destined to be a laboratory experiment rather than a production reality. For the XP-882, this was a crushing blow. The sleek prototype had been built to showcase the engine's promise, but now the very heart of the car was under attack. Without a viable rotary, the dream of an all-new Corvette supercar began to crumble, and behind closed doors at GM, whispers started spreading. Maybe the future wasn't rotary at all. Maybe the Corvette's destiny still lay with the rumbling, fire-breathing V8 that had carried it this far. The XP-882's fate. As the rotary dream collapsed under its own weight, the XP-882 Corvette found itself at a crossroads. For all its futuristic promise, it was still a car without a heartbeat, a beautiful shell tied to an engine program that GM no longer believed in. The first XP-882 prototype was pushed into storage, a quiet corner of GM's research, facilities where failed experiments went to collect dust. For many inside the company, it was simply another what if in a long line of ambitious projects abandoned by budget cuts and shifting priorities. But for a handful of engineers, it was more than that. They had seen the car's potential up close, felt its presence, and knew it represented a vision too, powerful to be forgotten. Interestingly, the XP-882 didn't die in isolation. Its sleek lines, wide stance, and forward-looking aerodynamics left a mark inside GM's design studios, even as the rotary engine program fizzled out, the body design lived on. elements of the XP-882 would resurface in. Later, Corvette concepts, particularly the Aeronet, XP-895, and eventually the mid-engine. Corvette experiments that stretched all the way into the 21st century. But fate had one more twist in store. In 1970, as GM debated what to do with the XP-882, word leaked that Ford was working on a mid-engine Mustang concept. Suddenly, the idea of a mid-engine Corvette didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. Chevrolet's leadership dusted off the XP-882 and ordered it prepared for a public debut at the 1970 New York Auto Show. The car rolled onto the show floor like a spaceship, its wedge-shaped profile hidden. Headlights and futuristic proportions stunned the crowd. Journalists swarmed it, asking if this was the Corvette of the future. For a moment, the XP-882 stole the spotlight and gave Corvette fans a glimpse of what could have been, but when the dust settled, reality returned. The rotary program was still in shambles. The oil crisis was beginning to reshape the industry, and GM executives weren't willing to gamble billions on a risky new direction. So, after its dazzling show debut, the XP-882 was quietly pulled back into storage. Unlike many GM prototypes that were destroyed after serving their purpose, the XP-882 survived. Today, the car still exists, restored and preserved as a tantalizing reminder of the road not taken. Enthusiasts who see it in person often describe a bittersweet feeling. On one hand, it's thrilling to stand in front of such a daring experiment. On the other, it's hard not to wonder, what if? What if GM had stuck with the rotary and perfected it the way Mazda did? What if the XP-882 had become the production Corvette of the mid-1970s? Would it have rewritten American sports car history, or would it have been a financial disaster that crippled Chevrolet's most iconic model? Those questions may never have answers, but the XP-882's fate sealed one truth. Sometimes even the boldest visions can't outrun the realities of technology, timing, and corporate caution. Legacy of the XP-882. Even though the XP-882 never reached production, its fingerprints can be traced across decades of Corvette history. In many ways, it was less of a failure and more of a prototype that arrived too early for its own time. For one, the design language it pioneered didn't disappear when GM shelved the project. Its sharp wedge nose, dramatic proportions, and mid-engine stance resurfaced in later Corvette experiments like the XP-895 Aerovet, which was built with aluminum bodywork, and even briefly tested with alternative powertrains. The XP-882 was also a conceptual ancestor to the string of mid-engine prototypes that GM flirted with from the 1970s through the 1990s, each one inching closer to the dream of a production mid-engine Corvette. Most importantly, the XP-882 kept the mid-engine conversation alive inside GM. Without it, the leap to the modern C8 Corvette might never have happened. When Chevrolet finally unveiled the mid-engine C8 in 2019, it was hailed as revolutionary. But for those who knew the story, it was really the payoff to a journey that had started almost 50 years earlier, in the dimly lit design studios where the XP-882 first took shape. The rotary dream may have collapsed, but the idea of radical experimentation lived on. GM engineers carried forward the lesson that Corvette couldn't just copy competitors, it had to take risks, even if some of them ended in dead ends. Enthusiasts who see the XP-882 today in museums or private collections often remark that It looks surprisingly modern, even half a century later. Its wide haunches, hidden headlights, and futuristic profile still draw crowds. To many, it's a symbol of the Corvette's untamed side, the version of America's sports car that wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with Ferrari, Lamborghini, or Porsche, not just in performance but in sheer audacity, and perhaps that's the XP-882's greatest legacy. Not the car it could have been, but the reminder that progress always demands risk. Sometimes those risks pay off, sometimes they don't, but they leave behind ideas that fuel the next generation. When the C8 rolled out to global applause, some veterans at GM quietly smiled. They knew the car that finally broke the front-engine tradition owed a debt to an obscure prototype that most of the world had forgotten. The XP-882 may not have made it to the production line, but in spirit, it had crossed the finish line half a century later. The rotary that never roared. The story of the XP-882 is one of ambition colliding with reality. In the early 1970s, GM dared to imagine a Corvette that broke every rule, mid-engine, futuristic, and powered by a rotary heart, unlike anything America had ever built. It was bold, it was radical, and it was doomed. The rotary dream collapsed under the weight of emissions regulations, fuel crises, and the cold calculus of corporate decision-making. The XP-882 was mothballed, another casualty of what might have been. To most of the world, it was forgotten. But to those who know the Corvette story, the XP-882 stands as a hidden milestone, a signpost pointing toward a future that would only arrive decades later. In many ways, the XP-882 is less about failure and more about persistence. It proved that GM was willing, at least for a moment, to gamble big, to chase innovation at full throttle. And even though that specific gamble didn't pay off, the spirit behind it eventually led to triumph. Because when the C8 Corvette finally roared onto the scene in 2019, with its mid-engine layout and supercar-shaming performance, it felt like a ghost from 1972 had come back to life. The XP-882 never got its chance, but its DNA, its vision, lived on in the car that redefined the Corvette forever. So, the next time you see a C8 carving through the streets, remember, half a century. Earlier, in a quiet GM workshop, a strange rotary-powered prototype whispered the same promise. That Corvette was always destined to evolve, always destined to push boundaries, and always destined to remind the world that America's sports car could dream just as big as Europe's finest. The XP-882 may have been the rotary that never roared, but its echo can still be heard in every Corvette that dares to chase the impossible. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic automotive adventures. Your support keeps these stories alive.